Let's speak to someone who may be familiar with the water space. That's the former Water Director General and Engineer, Professor Mike Muller. Prof, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Where do we start looking for reasons for why we are where we are today, where we're told that the water grid is virtually at near collapse and there's no money, by the way, to fix it?
Good evening to you and your viewers. Yeah, when you see headlines like that, you sort of want to run outside and fill a jerry can of water. I don't think that's the real challenge. I don't think Joburg's water is going to fail anytime soon, although there's lots of people in Joburg who during the last few months have had problems. I don't think that it's going to fail, and partly it's because the news that we got today isn't actually new. We've been told for some years now that Johannesburg Water has to replace a certain number of its pipes every year because they're old, some of them break, some of them leak, and it's just good practice to keep renewing your infrastructure.
So why are they not doing it?
What we learn is that they haven't been doing that because they haven't been given the money by the city of Johannesburg to, buy the pipes and lay the new pipes. So that is a very serious problem, but it doesn't mean we're about to collapse tomorrow. It does mean we'll continue to see too many leaks in the city. It does mean there won't be sometimes enough water to go around to get to everybody 24 hours a day. But this idea of a collapse of the grid, I think, is a serious exaggeration. Someone tells me it's election time, and we've got to make the problems look even worse than they are. I'd prefer us to focus on the real challenge, which is how do we get Johannesburg Water into a position where it can run its system reliably, replace things when they need to be replaced, and look after its customers, by the way, in a kind of respectful and organized manner, because a lot of the Joburg Water's customers are very unhappy about the way they're treated.
Yeah, so let's try and get those answers then, Professor. How does the city of Johannesburg run a reliable water service when you are told that there is a 60 billion rand budget deficit?
Good. Well, there have been a number of discussions between sort of citizens groups and the city of Johannesburg and Joburg Water over the last few months. And one of the things that we have come to a conclusion and there's a general agreement about is that quite a lot of the money that Joburg, the city, gets from you and me as water users doesn't get to Joburg Water. And, Joburg Water gets about R1 billion a year to, rehabilitate and replace infrastructure. They say they need at least 2 billion, but they collect more than that. But it gets kept by the city and is used for other purposes. So the first thing we've got to say is we need to have enough money to fix the water system and keep it running. One way of getting that money is we rely on people to pay their bills, and we can come back to who pays and who doesn't pay. But when people pay their bills, can that money please be used to provide water? And actually that's not always happening. Quite a lot of that money is held back and used for other purposes. And this is the difficulty we have in Johannesburg, because we've got the city of Johannesburg, which gets the money, but we've got Joburg Water, which does the work and is actually a separate organization with its own CEO and its own board. But the sharing out of the money, I'm afraid, is something which Joburg Water doesn't have too much say in.
So where does this money go to, Professor? We'll talk about the residents who also have got to do their part, because I've got a very interesting question for you in that regard. But where does this money go to? Is corruption part and parcel of this mess?
This again is one of those, we've got to be careful about every time we see a problem we think it's corruption. There was an agreement 20, 30 years ago that when local government was set up, it was going to be given various sources of money. It would get government grants, they would get an equitable share, particularly to pay for services to poor people. But it was also said that municipalities could set tariffs for electricity and water, and they could keep some of the money. Now, they've now begun to rely on that. We know that the electricity cost is very heavily loaded to get more money from the consumers to be used for libraries, important things, libraries and, the other public services. And the same has been happening with water. So we have to ask the question, are we getting fair value for what we pay for water? Should we maybe ask people to pay more so that we can have more money for water and more money for libraries and other facilities? But we need to have enough money going to the service provider, Joburg Water, to let them do their job. And at the moment they don't get that. And I don't think there's any argument between any of the people involved that actually Joburg Water needs more money. They're not getting all the money that we pay for water, and we perhaps need to think about how best to get that reorganized.
Then let's come, Professor, to what you said earlier, and that is that for the Johannesburg water authorities to run an efficient service, yes, they've got to get money from other authorities higher up the chain, but also important in this are residents themselves who have to pay. But the challenge here, Professor, is that you have water and electricity tariffs that keep going up, yet they are dealing with an intermittent service. And so they're going to start asking, why should we pay for a service we sometimes get and a service we sometimes do not get?
Yeah. And I suppose, if we were trying to be give a clever answer, and I wouldn't recommend this to Joburg Water, we'd say, well, better pay for getting something sometime and, rather than having nothing at all. But I don't think that's helpful. There is a challenge because we know that what people in the city can afford is getting tighter and tighter. We're not having a particularly strong economic boom at the moment, and everybody is looking at what they can afford. We also know that there are people who don't pay for water, people who get free water but then actually use far more than the free water and then there's a question, because that water use isn't metered. And there is perhaps a feeling of unfairness that some people are paying regularly for their water, they pay honestly, they pay on time, but they know that there are people in the city who get free basic water. That's fine. We all agree free basic water should be a right, but not free as much as you can take, because the city doesn't come round to meter, and if it does meter and bill, doesn't collect the bills. And I think there's this concern about whether the revenue collection is working properly and whether it's working fairly, because a lot of people, if you speak to them in Johannesburg, worry about their bills being actually sometimes just crazy. They're not read for months on end. They get bills with tens of thousands of rand. They get threatened with being cut off. This is not the way you build cooperative relations between a city and its citizens. This is a surefire recipe for having fights and having disagreements. And I think Joburg Water and the city, which does a lot of the bill collection, have got to start working better in their relations with you and me as citizens and water users.
As we taper down, let's talk about whether or not the water authorities in Johannesburg specifically are up to the challenge. What do I mean by this? The water pipes that they have to replace, and you have said they get a certain budget, R1 billion a year, in order to replace these. Sometimes, as you've said, they don't get this money. Is it possible that the water authorities are going to be able to fix this with minimal pain to the residents, to the paying residents?
Yeah. I think that's an important question. Lots of us who travel around the city, and of course it's not just Joburg, but let's talk about Joburg. We travel around the city, we see things all day that worry us. We see water leaks that don't get repaired for a long time. Quite often they get repaired and then they're broken again within a week and people have to come back. So you get the sense that the pace of work isn't adequate and the quality of work that's done isn't good enough. And that wastes money and it wastes time. And I think people would be much more comfortable if they could see that the work was being done properly, promptly, technically correct, and that once it was fixed, we could rest assured for a few more months. And we don't have that feeling at the moment. So I think a lot of work has to be done in Johannesburg Water. And I happen to know that they have got a lot of people, I won't say breathing down their neck, but sitting around the table trying to help them. Joburg Water needs help. They need to do the work better. They certainly need more money, but usually I'd say, let's get the organization working much better, and then we can start putting the money in, because we'll be sure the money would be used well. And we're still at that frontier. We're not sure whether it's the right time yet to put a lot more money in. Is Joburg Water really ready to use it properly? And we need to work on both fronts at the same time, I think.
Finally, Professor, and very briefly, please. Is there a reason, perhaps, that we should start worrying about the quality of the water we are getting?
In Gauteng, which is supplied by Rand Water, our water is generally safe. I drink it all the time. I wouldn't dream of doing anything else. The only exception, and this comes back to how well we manage those pipelines. If there's a break in the water, if a pipe has to be fixed, there's water in the road, dirty water might get in the pipe. If that isn't properly managed, and that comes back to managing this job properly, you can have a bit of contaminated water gets into the pipe. And that's why we need to have trust in the quality of the work that Joburg Water does. Because the water that comes from Rand Water, I'm 100% comfortable with. But I do worry if I see a hole in the road, it's full of muddy water, and I don't see what people often complain about is a stream of water coming out some pipe or some hydrant as they drain the pipes to make sure that the water going in is now all clean. So that would be one concern. If there's been a breakdown in your area and the water's coming out muddy, don't drink it straight away. Let it run clean first, and then you'll be safe. But the basic quality of water in Gauteng continues to be excellent.
Professor Mike Muller, thank you very much for your time, a former Director General in the Water Department, and he's also an engineer by trade.